The glass dome ceiling of the Summit Gala felt like it was crashing down. Zola's palms burned as they hit the floor, her arms instantly locking around her 6-month belly. Around her, the meticulously crafted architectural models she'd spent months building lay in splinters, shards of wood and acrylic scattered like debris from a fallen empire. "Stay in the dirt where a ghost belongs," Vane's voice cut through the gasps of the elite guests. He loomed over her, his polished leather shoe still planted where he delivered the shove. Behind him, Sora adjusted her pearls, her eyes tracing Zola's form with the cold detachment of a predator. Zola's wrist throbbed, her white silk gown stained by the wine from the shattered table. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the ice in her veins.
"The baby. Please, let my baby be okay." "Whose kid is it, Zola?"
Vane leaned down, his face a mask of designer arrogance.
"Because we both know it's not mine. I left you with nothing in that storm 10 months ago.
Did you just find the first Korean man with a pulse to sponsor your little scam?"
The room felt small, suffocating. Not here. Not in the city where she had finally found her breath.
"This has nothing to do with you," Zola whispered, her voice trembling but defiant.
"Let me up." Sora let out a sharp, jagged laugh.
"She probably doesn't even know who the father is, Vane.
Is this the strategy?
Get pregnant by a stranger and pretend you're high society." The words weren't just insults, they were echoes of the night Vane had stolen her blueprints and left her for dead in a medical crisis.
"Scam."
Zola's face went deathly white. "You stole my life's work while I couldn't even stand.
You left me in the rain to die."
The memory slammed back.
10 months ago. The night the Iron Shadow found her.
Vane didn't just stand there, he thrived in the silence of the room. The elite of the coastal district stared, their faces blurred behind champagne flutes, but not one person moved to help Zola. Sora leaned in close, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the metallic smell of the shattered architectural models. She whispered loud enough for the front row to hear, mocking Zola's white silk gown and the way it now clung to her trembling frame. Vane reached down, not to offer a hand, but to snatch the gold-embossed invitation from Zola's clutch. He tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter down onto her pregnant belly like mocking confetti. He told her that a thief who built her life on lies didn't deserve to breathe the same air as innovators. Zola gritted her teeth, her fingers digging into the cold marble. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a woman who had survived a storm he couldn't even imagine. Just as Vane raised his voice to call for security to drag her out, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the grand entrance. It wasn't the sound of guests arriving. It was the sound of boots, synchronized and heavy. The massive double doors of the rooftop gala swung open with a force that made the glass walls vibrate. A phalanx of men in razor-sharp dark suits marched in, their expressions as neutral as stone. They didn't look at the priceless art or the celebrities. They ignored the gala hosts who rushed forward to greet them with confused smiles. Instead, they moved like a dark tide, parting the crowd with terrifying efficiency. Vane straightened his sweater, his arrogance momentarily replaced by a flicker of greed. He assumed these were the high-level investors he had been waiting for to back his latest project. He stepped forward, putting on his most charming smile and reaching out a hand to the lead man in the security detail. But the man didn't even blink. He walked straight past Vane, brushing his shoulder with such force that Vane stumbled back into Sora. The guards formed a perfect, protective semicircle around Zola. The chattering of the crowd died instantly, replaced by a suffocating tension. Then, the heavy footsteps slowed. A tall figure emerged from the center of the dark suits, dressed in an all-black bespoke suit that seemed to swallow the light of the chandeliers. It was Kaelen. His presence felt like the arrival of a cold front over a summer sea. He didn't look at Vane. He didn't look at the crowd. His sharp, intense eyes were fixed entirely on the woman on the floor. 10 months before the lights of the gala, the world was dark and smelled of wet concrete. Zola stood in the center of a half-finished construction site, her boots sinking into the mud as a brutal storm lashed against the skeletal steel beams. She was holding a leather tube tight against her chest, protecting the only thing she had left, the blueprints for the Horizon project. These weren't just drawings, they were her soul, a revolutionary design meant to bring light and safety to the city's poorest districts. Beside her stood Vane, his face pale under the flickering sight lights, looking more like a stranger than the man she was supposed to marry. The betrayal didn't happen with a shout, but with a cold, calculated reach. Vane had claimed he needed to check the final structural seals before the inspectors arrived, but as soon as the blueprints were in his hands, his gaze changed. He looked at the designs with a greed that made Zola's blood run cold. He didn't see a vision for the future, he saw a ticket to the elite world he craved. When Zola doubled over in sudden, searing pain, the first terrifying signs of a medical crisis that threatened her pregnancy, she reached for him, gasping his name. Vane didn't move to catch her. Instead, he stepped back, tucking her life's work under his arm. He told her that a woman like her would only hold him back, that she was a ghost, whose name would never be on a cornerstone. As the thunder drowned out her cries for help, Vane walked toward his car, leaving her collapsed on the wet gravel. He drove away, his taillights disappearing into the rain, leaving Zola alone in the dark to die with her unborn child. She had dragged herself through the mud, her fingers clawing at the earth, losing consciousness as the cold seeped into her bones. She had been ready to give up, to let the shadows take her, until a pair of heavy boots stopped beside her. She hadn't seen his face then, only the silhouette of a man who looked like he belonged to the storm itself. That was the night Kaelen found her, the night the architect of her destruction unknowingly handed her to the man who would become her fortress. Kaelen stood in the center of the gala, his presence turning the room into a tomb. Vane, recovered from his initial shock, puffed out his chest and tried to regain his footing. He didn't recognize the man in black, but he recognized the expensive suit. He stepped forward with a fake laugh, telling Kaelen that he had arrived at a private event and that he should take his hired muscle and leave before the real authorities were called. He pointed a finger at Zola, sneering that she was just a trespassing fraud who was being escorted out. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Kaelen didn't move a muscle, but the lead guard stepped forward, his voice a low, vibrating growl that silenced the remaining whispers in the crowd. He didn't call Kaelen a CEO or a director. He called him the owner of the port. The title hit Vane like a physical blow. In this coastal district, the owner of the port wasn't just a businessman. He was the ghost who controlled every shipment, every dock, and every secret that entered the city. He was the man the police didn't touch and the man the politicians bowed to. Kaelen finally moved, but only to kneel on the marble floor. The crowd gasped as the most feared man in the region lowered himself into the debris of the shattered models. He didn't care about his expensive suit or the eyes of the elite. He reached out with hands that looked like they were carved from iron, but his touch was as light as a feather when he tucked a loose strand of hair behind Zola's ear. He didn't ask her if she was okay, he already knew the answer. He whispered that the shadow had arrived, and that she would never have to touch the cold ground again. Vane's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He remembered the night of the storm. He remembered the construction site where he had left a nobody to disappear. He realized now that he hadn't just abandoned a woman. He had accidentally handed a treasure to the only man capable of destroying him. Kaelen stood up slowly, lifting Zola into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He finally turned his gaze toward Vane. It wasn't an angry look. It was the look of a predator watching an insect. He told Vane that he had spent 10 months looking for the man who left his wife in the rain. Now that he had found him, the real storm was just beginning. Kaelen didn't just stand in the room, he owned the air within it. As he held Zola, the silence was so heavy that the sound of the wind whipping against the gala's glass walls seemed like a roar. The elite guests, who only moments ago were snickering at Zola's humiliation, now stepped back in a wave of terror. They realized that the man holding her was the same man who owned the very ground their businesses stood on. Vane tried to speak, his voice cracking like thin ice. He stammered about a misunderstanding, claiming he was simply trying to help Zola up, but Kaelen's silence was more terrifying than any shout. Kaelen didn't waste words on a man like Vane. Instead, he looked at his lead guard and gave a single slight nod. In an instant, the security detail didn't just protect the space, they locked it down. No one was leaving this rooftop until the debt was settled. Sora, clutching her emerald dress, tried to slink into the shadows of the crowd, but the cold, blue-toned light of the gala seemed to follow her every move. She realized that the nobody they had tried to erase was now the most powerful woman in the room. Kaelen finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous, announcing to the entire room that Zola wasn't a guest. She was the owner of the very blueprints Vane had claimed as his own. He revealed that the Horizon project belonged to his wife, and that anyone who had supported Vane's theft was now an enemy of the port. The atmosphere shifted from a social gathering to a courtroom. The high society chill had been replaced by industrial power. Zola, leaning her head against Kaelen's chest, felt the fear that had haunted her for 10 months finally begin to melt away. She wasn't the girl in the rain anymore. She was the queen of a territory Vane would never be able to enter again. The justice she had waited for wasn't just coming, it had arrived, and it was colder than the storm that had almost taken her life. Kaelen didn't raise his voice, yet the room felt as if the oxygen had been sucked out of it. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, slate-gray folder embossed with the seal of the Port Authority. He didn't throw it, he held it out, forcing Vane to step forward into the circle of guards to take it. Vane's hands shook as he opened the cover, his eyes darting across the pages. What he found there wasn't just a record of his theft, but a death warrant for his career. The file was filled with high-resolution photos of rusted support beams and chemical analysis reports of substandard concrete. Kaelen's voice was as cold as a winter tide as he explained the steel scandal to the horrified crowd. He revealed that when Vane stole Zola's blueprints 10 months ago, he hadn't understood the complex physics behind her designs. To save money and hide his lack of knowledge, Vane had authorized the use of cheap, brittle steel in 3 major luxury high-rises currently being built across the city. You didn't just steal her vision, Vane, Kaelen said, his eyes tracking the beads of sweat rolling down the villain's forehead. You corrupted it. Those buildings aren't monuments to your success, they are upright coffins. Zola watched from the safety of Kaelen's side, seeing the man who once mocked her unworthiness turn a ghostly shade of white. Vane tried to flip through the pages, looking for a way to deny the evidence, but the reports were signed by the city's top independent inspectors, men who answered only to the port. The high society guests who had backed Vane's projects began to murmur in panic, realizing their investments were crumbling along with the buildings. Sora backed away from Vane as if his failure was contagious, her pearls rattling against her neck. Kaelen told the room that the structural fraud had already been reported to the Ministry of Justice. Vane wasn't just a thief anymore, he was a man responsible for a catastrophe waiting to happen. The blueprints Zola had nearly died to protect were now the very evidence that would lock Vane away forever. Sora stood frozen as the whispers of the elite turned into a roar of condemnation. She looked at Vane, who was clutching the steel scandal file with trembling hands, and she felt a wave of disgust. To her, he was no longer a rising star or a ticket to a higher social circle. He was a sinking ship. She took a calculated step away from him, smoothing her emerald dress and putting on a mask of fake innocence. She began to tell the surrounding guests that she had been deceived just like them, claiming she had no idea Vane was capable of such dangerous fraud. She turned toward Kaelen with a forced, sweet smile, hoping to charm her way out of the disaster. She told him that she admired his strength and that she was more than willing to testify against Vane to ensure justice was served. Sora even tried to reach out to Zola, offering a hollow apology and claiming she had only been trying to protect Vane because she didn't know the truth. She was ready to leave Vane in the ruins of his own making, thinking she could walk away with her family's reputation intact. But Kaelen didn't return her smile. His expression remained as cold as stone as he watched her attempt to play both sides. He signaled to his lead guard, who handed him a second, thinner folder. Kaelen told Sora that she shouldn't be so quick to abandon her partner, because her family's future was now tied to the very ground she stood on. He revealed that while she was busy social climbing, her father's shipping company had fallen into massive debt. The color drained from Sora's face as Kaelen opened the folder to show her the signatures. He hadn't just been investigating Vane's fraud, he had been systematically buying up every loan, every mortgage, and every debt her family owed to the banks. He told her that as of that morning, he was her family's sole creditor. Sora realized with a jolt of horror that she couldn't jump ship because Kaelen now owned the ship. The contractual trap had snapped shut. Sora's pearl necklace seemed to tighten around her throat as she realized she was just as trapped as Vane. Kaelen's Vanguard stood behind her like shadows, making it clear that her days of cold satisfaction were over. Zola watched in silence, seeing the woman who had once mocked her for being a stranger realize that she was now at the mercy of the very people she had tried to destroy. The silence of the gala was shattered not by a voice, but by the synchronized vibration of 100 smartphones. Vane looked down at his own screen, his eyes widening as a news alert flashed in bright red. The headline was a hammer blow, arrest warrant issued for Vane, corporate manslaughter and structural fraud. Across the room, guests gasped as live footage began to stream, showing police units and building inspectors swarming Vane's headquarters and the construction sites of his compromised towers. Vane's empire was no longer a dream, it was a falling tower, collapsing in real time before the city's elite. The investors who had once clinked glasses with him now scrambled to distance themselves, their faces twisted in anger as they realized their fortunes were tied to a criminal. Kaelen stood motionless, still holding Zola, as the sound of sirens began to wail from the streets below, climbing higher and higher toward the rooftop. The double doors of the gala burst open for the second time that night, but this time it wasn't the Vanguard. Uniformed officers marched toward Vane, who dropped the steel scandal file, the papers fluttering around his feet like the ruins of his stolen blueprints. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Vane looked at Zola one last time, his arrogance completely replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had lost everything. He had tried to erase her existence, but in the end, his own name was the one being wiped from the city's skyline. Sora watched in terror as the officers led Vane away, knowing that with Kaelen holding her family's debt, she was next to face the consequences of her cruelty. The absolute justice Kaelen had promised was no longer a threat, it was a reality that had finally leveled the playing field. The sun was setting over the industrial harbor, casting long orange shadows across the rusted shipping containers and the cold gray water. Vane sat on a wooden crate near the edge of the pier, his once expensive sweater now stained and his hair messy. He was no longer the arrogant man from the gala, he was a man waiting for a prison transport, stripped of his title and his pride. The only sounds were the distant crying of seagulls and the gentle lapping of the waves against the dock. The sound of steady footsteps on the gravel made him look up. Zola stood before him, her white maternity dress glowing in the fading light. She looked radiant and strong, a sharp contrast to the ruins of the man who had once tried to destroy her. In her hand, she held a simple leather tube. Without saying a word, she unrolled a thick sheet of paper and held it out so Vane could see it one last time. They were the original blueprints for the Horizon project, the real ones. Vane stared at the intricate lines and the complex mathematical notes written in Zola's hand. For months, he had tried to build her designs, but he had failed because he only saw the shapes, not the heart behind them. He didn't understand that the beauty of her work came from her desire to protect people, a concept he had never grasped. "You thought you stole my future," Zola said, her voice calm and steady as the ocean. "But you only stole paper. You could never steal the mind that created it." She pointed to a specific section of the drawing, showing him the structural flaw that had caused his towers to crumble. It was a detail so small that only a true architect would notice, and it was the very reason his empire had turned into a nightmare. Vane reached out a shaking hand, as if to touch the paper, but Zola pulled it back. She rolled up the blueprints and tucked them away, looking at him with a pity that hurt more than any insult. She told him that while he spent his years in a cell, she would be building a city that he would never be allowed to touch. As the police cars arrived to take him away, Zola turned her back on the ruins of her past and walked toward the car where Kaelen was waiting, leaving Vane alone with the ghost of a brilliance he would never understand. The sterile white walls of the private medical wing were bathed in the soft, golden light of a new dawn. Kaelen stood by the window, his usual suit jacket cast aside, watching the city skyline he had fought so hard to secure. Behind him, the rhythmic sound of a heart monitor filled the room with a peaceful, steady beat. Zola lay in the center of the bed, her face exhausted but glowing with a joy that no gala or contract could ever provide. Wrapped in a soft white blanket in her arms was the baby, the child who had survived the rain, the betrayal, and the ruins. As Zola looked down at her child, a soft chime from the television on the wall drew her attention. A special news broadcast was beginning, but the red, breaking news banners were no longer about scandals or arrests. Instead, the screen showed the official seal of the Ministry of Urban Development. The city's highest officials were standing in front of the Horizon construction site, which had been cleared of Vane's defective steel and was now being rebuilt under the port's direct supervision. The lead official spoke clearly into the microphones, announcing the clearing of the name for the city's most important project. He officially stripped Vane of all professional titles and declared that the true intellectual property of the Horizon designs belonged solely to Zola. For the first time, her name was read aloud not as a victim, but as the city's lead architect. The broadcast showed a digital rendering of the completed sanctuary, with Zola's name etched in stone at the entrance. Kaelen walked to the bedside and placed a hand on Zola's shoulder, his eyes softening as he looked at his wife and their new legacy. The imposter syndrome that had once made Zola doubt her place in this world was gone, replaced by the weight of the gold medal the city had sent to the hospital in her honor. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's story. She was the creator of a new world, and as her baby gripped her finger, Zola knew that the foundation they had built was finally unbreakable. The morning sun sparkled off the harbor, reflecting against the glass and steel of the completed Horizon sanctuary. The building was a masterpiece of light and open spaces, standing tall on the very land where Zola had once been left with nothing. Below the balcony, the courtyard was filled with life. Women who had been marginalized and families who had lost their homes were moving through the halls, finding the safety and dignity that Zola had promised to build for them. The air was no longer thick with the smell of wet concrete and betrayal, but with the scent of sea salt and hope. Zola stood on the wide white balcony, her hand resting on the smooth stone railing. Beside her, Kaelen stood as a silent, powerful shadow, his gaze moving across the crowd with the satisfaction of a man whose mission was complete. He wasn't looking at the city as a territory to be conquered, but as a place he had helped heal. The absolute restoration they had fought for was finally visible in the smiles of the people below. In Zola's other arm, her child slept peacefully, tucked away from the harsh winds that once threatened their future. Zola looked out at the horizon, realizing that the sanctuary was more than just a building. It was a living shield for those who had been silenced by people like Vane and Sora. The villains were gone, locked away by the weight of their own crimes, while the architect they tried to erase was now the cornerstone of the city's heart. Kaelen reached out, his fingers brushing against Zola's hand as they watched the sun rise higher over the sanctuary. There was no more fear, no more running, and no more ghosts. They had turned a night of rain and ruin into a legacy of light. As the first bell of the community center rang out, signaling the start of a new day, Zola leaned into Kaelen's side, finally at peace in the empire they had built on the foundation of truth and love. And so, the storm that was meant to bury Zola became the very thing that washed her clean. In the ruins of Vane's lies and Sora's greed, a new foundation was laid, one built on truth, brilliance, and a love that even the Iron Shadow couldn't hide. Kaelen and Zola proved that when you try to erase a masterpiece, you only make the artist stronger. Absolute justice has been served, and the Horizon Sanctuary now stands as a testament to those who refuse to be silenced. But as the sun sets on this chapter, one question remains. Can a past as dark as Kaelen's ever truly stay buried? Or is this peace just the quiet before an even greater storm? Thank you for witnessing this journey of betrayal and restoration. If you want to see what happens when the shadows return to claim their debt in part 2, make sure to subscribe to my channel, Rose Noir Tales. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of this epic saga. Until next time, keep building your own horizon.